Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Murphy. I'm a board member and a volunteer for the Frederick Law Olmsted Society. Tonight, I'm here to introduce Jim Petrzilka, a man who is both as knowledgeable as he is generous, knowledgeable of Riverside's history, generous in terms of his time and talents in service of the community. He's been a resident of Riverside for 46 years. He's been a member of FLOSS for the same 46 years. Not another.
I hope not.
He's been a member of the board of the Olmsted Society since 2009. He's also worked at the Riverside Historical Museum, which I suspect there was a little bit of enlightened self-interest there. He got to delve into the archives of the town, and we benefited from his work as a volunteer there. And he's been leading the walking tours in Riverside for the last 15 years, in most recent years organizing and promoting the walking tours that are offered once a month, May to October, the last Sunday of the month. That's a little advertisement there. So Jim and I have talked about the script of the walking tours, and if it were read verbatim, it's a little bit dry. It was written by architects and landscape designers for architects and landscape designers. But any good tour guide will embellish, and if you've ever had the opportunity to go on a walking tour with Jim, you'll know that he has a lot of stories, a lot of interesting facts about the community to relate. So I'd like to think that tonight's presentation is sort of an armchair walking tour of the town through its history and through its streets. So with that, here's Jim.
I'm really wired here. So hopefully, I won't get hung up on all the wires. Yeah, I'm a relative newcomer to Riverside, only 46 years. But I've always been interested in history, and I'm presently on the Historical Commission, as Dan mentioned, and a board member of the Olmsted Society, where I do chair the walking tours. So, quick question, how many came for the history? Raise your hands. And how many came for the mysteries? Yeah, right, I thought so. Well, we have plenty of both, including where the bodies are buried, literally. We'll get to that in a bit. But I'll be giving you the facts as I know them, as opposed to the alternative facts. But some of my conclusions are only based on circumstantial evidence, and you are free to draw your own conclusions. The history goes back a long, long way into geologic time. We are all familiar with our beautiful village as it is today, with its lush landscapes, curving roads, gas lamps, and beautiful homes. So it may be somewhat jarring to realize that the Native Americans also revered this place. And why not? It had high ground, freshwater springs, access to river transportation, strategic trails and portages, and access to adequate timber in an otherwise treeless and swampy plain. This is actually the Wolf Road Prairie down 31st Street a ways. It's one of the last remaining virgin prairies, but this is probably what a good part of our area looked like back in the long ago day. So the Native Americans, it's a good place to dwell a while, do some hunting, fishing, and trading, and also a scenic place to bury your revered dead. So they did all of that. Artifacts have been found here dating back to 8,000 BC, when, believe it or not, Riverside, or at least the northwest portion of the village, was prime beachfront property. Yep, Long Common Road. Our main route through town was once a beach on Lake Michigan. or Lake Chicago, as the geologists call it, as was Scottswood Road and Riverside Drive in Berwyn, along the same beach, dubbed the Calumet Beach by the geologists. The Ice Age glaciers were melting, the lake was 60 feet higher, and this area probably resembled the Indiana Dunes of today as the waters flowed in a torrent to the southwest. As the glaciers finally melted and the lake receded, the old beach, being the highest ground around, became an Indian trail, part of the Green Bay Trail system, heading south-southwest. There was a Des Plaines River ford at Riverside that led to trails west and southwest, the present-day Ogden Avenue and Plainfield roads. The Riverside area became an interchange on a prehistoric superhighway. Today, Ogden Avenue, US Route 34, also an old Indian trail, later known as the Southwest Plank Road, with a toll booth just kitty corner from today's P.J. Clem's restaurant in Lyons. Toll booths, yeah, they started early. And later in the Chicago portion, known as Riverside Boulevard, still follows the old Indian Trail. How far? As far as Trail Ridge Road, 12,000 feet up in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. And old Route 66, our slightly more modern trail, just touches Riverside's southeast corner. In addition to Indian artifacts, the early European settlers found numerous buried human remains in the middle of what is now the 1st Division of Riverside and around the Scottswood, Blooming Bank, and Fairbank Roads area. It was an Indian burial ground which dated up to the historic era. In 1673, the first recorded Europeans, Marquette and Joliet, traveled through our area, lured by Indian accounts of a short portage from the Mississippi drainage to the Great Lakes. We commemorate that, where am I here? Chicago Portage. We commemorate this at the Chicago Portage National Historic Site at 47th and Harlem Avenue, about 2.5 miles downriver from Riverside. This put Chicago on the maps. This was big. A mere 14 miles as the rivers flowed from the Des Plaines River, paddling east through the appropriately named Mud Lake, over a short canoe portage to the south branch of the Chicago River and into Lake Michigan. It was immediately recognized as of great strategic importance. A short route through the then center of the country from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic Ocean, over a continental divide at Chicago, which some have speculated may have started out as a beaver dam. Of course, if you can get to the Mississippi from here via the rivers, you can also enter the Missouri River or the Ohio River and paddle your way to what is now Glacier National Park in Montana or the states of Pennsylvania or West Virginia. A lot of traffic passed through here, just like today. So strategic was the Chicago and Riverside area considered that the federal government built Fort Dearborn at the mouth of the Chicago River to protect it, and by Indian treaty acquired rights to a strip of land between Lake Michigan and Ottawa, Illinois, on the Illinois River, on which to build a canal linking the two. Everyone could see that there was going to be a lot of money made eventually at this pestilential swamp. Some of the earliest money was made by a pair of brothers, the Lawtons, who built a trading post in 1827 at the west end of the portage in what is now the Ottawa Trail Woods Forest Preserve at about 46th and Harlem. So far, the exact location of this trading post remains a mystery. Shortly after, the Lawtons, whoops, there goes my, yeah. Okay, there we go. Shortly after, the Lawtons, who by the way gave their name to Lawton Road in Riverside, built a tavern and trading post near the Riverside Ford, somewhere close, we think, to the present-day Lyons Bridge. The exact location of this trading post is also a mystery. David Lawton is supposed to have buried his 3 Indian wives in a mound which still exists in the backyard of a home on Fairbank Road. It's never been excavated, so we don't know. The Lawtons, taking advantage of a small waterfall in the Des Plaines, apparently built the first dam at this location, a wooden structure in 1827 to provide power for a sawmill. In 1831, things started to heat up with the arrival of Stephen Forbes and his wife Elvira. Forbes had been a school teacher at Fort Dearborn and decided to strike out with a 160-acre homestead on the Aux Plains River, purchased from the Lawtons, which later grew to almost 1,800 acres. He became the first sheriff of Cook County. His mother and father, Ann and Sean, and other family members followed. They all originally resided in a cabin, identified as the first cabin built west of Chicago near our present-day train station. Here's the marker on the site. In 1834, this cabin was the scene of a riotous party celebrating the election of Jean-Baptiste Beaubien as the first militia captain of Cook County, during which, to liven things up, barrels of bourbon whiskey were dumped into the freshwater spring at Swan Pond, which ever after was called Bourbon Spring. There's the marker on the site. And of course, it's now dried up. The bourbon string is no more. But that's right next to our present-day sledding hill. It also commemorates, the same marker also commemorates a visit by an army in 1832, which I'll talk about shortly, and an 1837 visit by Daniel Webster, the famous statesman and orator, who was met here, feted, and triumphantly escorted the 11 miles into the frontier town of Chicago. Flavilla Ann Forbes, John Forbes' granddaughter, is credited with being Riverside's first school teacher when, at age 11, and having received her father's schooling, she was persuaded to teach the few local children how to read and write. Her memories of her Riverside years were few, as she later moved to California. But she did vividly remember one evening while climbing to her sleeping loft, looking down and spying a curled up rattlesnake in a cooking pot. So it was the frontier then. In 1832, things heated up in a bigger way. Chief Blackhawk, having been shoved west of the Mississippi, decided to move back across the river and reclaim his tribe's ancestral lands, thus sparking the Blackhawk Indian War. The settlers, in a panic, appealed to the federal government for help. The government sent an army under the command of General Winfield Scott to deal with the problem. They arrived at Fort Dearborn by steamer, unfortunately afflicted with cholera, one of the bacterial disease Ebolas of the day that could kill within hours. The soldiers were dragged across the prairie to the site of Riverside to rest and recuperate for over a week. Here's a map one of them drew, much enlarged, showing they camped just above where Salt Creek empties into the Des Plaines. And there is no doubt that they buried some soldiers here. The brass buttons of a soldier's uniform were found during some garden digging in a backyard off of Blooming Bank Road, because that's what they used to do. They didn't know what caused cholera, but they buried anybody that had it and died, they buried all their clothes. So now, as commemorating that event, we have Scotswood Road, named after General Scott, and Scotswood Common. The Forbes family also established a family burial plot just west of their cabin along the banks of the Des Plaines. It was here also that the Lawton brothers, who died within a week of each other in 1834, were probably buried by Mr. Forbes. So we have the Indians, the soldiers, and the settlers, all buried around the 1st Division of Riverside. The most recent discovery of human remains was during some sewer work in 2017. You probably all remember that. Turns out, of course, now we have DNA, right? Turns out the DNA is of Middle Eastern ancestry. So there's a mystery. How did a Lebanese/Syrian/Palestinian get buried in Riverside in the early days? We don't know yet, still being worked on. Much of this area is still undisturbed ground, so there are likely more remains, including some reburied after their discovery in inconvenient places, like the site of the first Union Church, built by the Riverside Improvement Company, which is now the whoops, got ahead of myself there. Which is now the Presbyterian Church. The nice thing is, despite the diversity here, we have Indians, soldiers, settlers. They all seem to get along very well. I'll skip a few decades during which Chicago's population exploded and intermittent construction led in 1848, and now we go to the Illinois-Michigan Canal. No, we go back to the Illinois-Michigan Canal. Come on, come on. There we go. Illinois-Michigan Canal, right? Finally reliably linking the water route from the Atlantic Ocean via the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system. And that new technological wonder of the age, the railroad, and now I'll get to the railroad, there we go, soon followed. By 1864, the Lion Stop at what is now Riverside was the end of the railroad line from Chicago. By 1865, this line was extended to Aurora and eventually became the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. Soon, in those early modern days, a railroad switchyard and roundhouse stood on the ground presently occupied by the Riverside Swim Club. Here's the Riverside portion of an 1851 map. I don't know how well you can all see that. This was a map of Cook County when Chicago's population was 28,000, 1851. You can see the Green Bay Trail and the Plank Road and the Riverside Sand Ridge, but no railroads yet. Another decade, and here's an 1861 map, when the land around Riverside was owned by several large landowners whose names mean nothing to us today. But of note, if you look there, if you could see on the lower right, southeast part of what is now Riverside, the village of Cooksville. Yeah, a guy named Cook had already decided to subdivide some of the land around here, and he platted a whole little town called Cooksville. But that's as far as it went. Never got developed and disappeared. And one other interesting thing on this map, the name of mystery here is why the name of Wesencraft does not appear. They were one of the pioneer families that was certainly here at the time. And their home on Pine Avenue, dating from the early 1850s, still stands. Not quite as elaborate as you see here, but it's still there. They even sold the CB&Q Railroad the land on which to build the right-of-way through what is now Riverside. Here's Jane Wesencraft in later years. So why was their name not on that map? I don't know. More time passed. The Riverside land changed hands, and by the 4th of July, 1868, I can't expect you to read all of that, but it's from the Tribune newspaper. By the 4th of July, 1868, a large group of invited guests and dignitaries converged on Riverside Farm, the country place of David A. Gage. He was the Chicago City Treasurer, proprietor of the Sherman House Hotel, and soon, in 1870, to be the first president of the new Chicago White Stockings baseball team. How about that? Here's one of the Gage farmhouses still with us at the northeast corner of Selborne and Long Common. Doesn't have the windmill anymore. But this party might have been partly held right over there. The speeches were many and patriotic. The horse races were thrilling, as Mr. Gage raised thoroughbred horses here. The spiked punch was delicious, the card games spirited, the political and business discussion intense, and the possibilities or details of subdividing and developing Riverside Farm were probably discussed by owner David Gage and some of his guests that day. Was Riverside born on the 4th of July, 1868? According to Gage's subsequent court filings, the first formal land sale between Gage and Emery Childs, the fast-talking promoter from the East who became president of the Riverside Improvement Company, was entered into on July 25th, 1868. It must have been a giddy time after the Civil War, when all things seemed possible. Chicago, a muddy, stinking, disease-ridden boomtown, needed a prestige suburb with easy access to the city, and yet far enough away for repose and exclusivity. Riverside Farm had the acreage, the location, the railroad, and the river. Gage had Riverside Farm. Childs had, so he said, the Eastern money connections needed to help fund the development. He also may have suggested enlisting a prestigious and respected name like Frederick Law Olmsted to help plan, develop, and sell the project. It could rightly be said that Frederick Law Olmsted, who you normally see with a long Santa Claus beard, but here's how he looked as a younger man. It could rightly be said that Frederick Law Olmsted created the profession of landscape architecture in America. He was already famous for having developed Central Park in New York as a people's park, and as a social thinker and promoter of democracy, he wanted to extend some of his ideas into town and regional planning. Riverside seemed a good fit for his new profession because as a landscape architect, he was also an expert in arranging land for human use and enjoyment, involving the judicious placement of structures, vehicular and pedestrian ways, plantings, and infrastructure. As Olmsted's partner, Galvard Vaux, who was an architect, once said concerning their approach to their work, nature first, second, and third, architecture after a while. Olmsted's 1869 plan of Riverside is now world famous among landscape architects and urban planners and developers. They come here from every corner of the world to view his masterpiece. His curvilinear sunken road system, coupled with extensive parklands and generous home setbacks, give Riverside a rural look and a green contrast to the rectangular grids of the surrounding suburbs and city. You can see it from outer space. Riverside's fluidity is a sharp contrast to many modern suburbs built with extensive cul-de-sacs. Riverside flows just like the river. Olmsted wrote a lengthy preliminary report to the Riverside Improvement Company laying out what should be done in Riverside and why. First, movement should be slowed down. The macadam or gravel roads, which by the way came from the quarrying of an Indian mound at Joliet, should exhibit gracefully curved lines, generous spaces, and the absence of sharp corners. The idea being to suggest and imply leisure, contemplativeness, and happy tranquility. This can be problematic in today's fast-paced society, where those in a hurry and used to the grid system can be flummoxed or infuriated by the slowdown and confusion caused by the curving roads. The residents, however, seem to understand and love it, even if they themselves can occasionally get disoriented. A charming example happened to me when one day, while doing front yard work, I was hailed by a perplexed-looking young lady who asked me for the directions to Parkway Road. She said she had lived here for 6 months and had taken her dog for a walk and now couldn't find her way home. She made it finally. I directed her correctly. Here's the only remnant of one of the original gutters that was laid out along each side of each road in Harrington Park. It's the only one left. I don't know, is the guy here? Lonnie, are you here? No, I guess he didn't come. There's the man that saved it. Thanks, Lonnie. Second of Olmsted's precepts, Olmsted said men may build ugly houses. Oh dear. And they shouldn't be allowed to annoy us with them as we pass by. We have no idea what his ideal home looked like, but we know he wanted to require homeowners to maintain 1 or 2 living trees on their property in front of each house. I am too chicken to show any Riverside house at this point, for fear of being vilified by the owners. But having been in many Riverside homes, I happen to think all Riverside houses are beautiful. Third, homes should have public, unfenced spaces in the front and private even fenced places in the back. Garden rooms, if you will. This is my wife Sandy's and I, one of our garden rooms. Fourth, a parkway promenade should be built to connect Riverside with Chicago so that resident commuters could have a stress-reducing 45-minute commute by horse or carriage between home and work. He didn't think the railroad was the way to go. Too noisy and smelly, and you're boxed in. This parkway should have separate ways for walking, horseback, carriage, and service traffic. The parkway was only partially built, but early maps depict portions of Ogden Avenue in Chicago and Cermak Road in Cicero and Berwyn as Riverside Boulevard. By the way, today during rush hour, it may take at least 45 minutes to produce that, traverse that same distance between Chicago and Riverside. And wouldn't we like a roadway we wouldn't have to share with gigantic semi-trucks? Olmsted was onto something with the trees, as modern-day controlled studies have shown that the number of public trees correlates to improved health, cognition, and mood of nearby residents. Something deep within us does respond to nature. To reduce it to overall value to society, one scientist, taking into account all the relevant variables and all the health benefits over time, concluded that if someone offers you $10,000 or 10 trees, take the trees. So every once in a while, you may want to hug your trees, or your neighbors who plant trees, or your hardworking village forester. There were 7 officers and directors of the Riverside Improvement Company. Among the things they did to promote and market the project was to hire a photographer, P.G. Green, to document the charms of this planned ideal suburban village. He did it via stereographs, the very popular 3D technique of the day. A collector of these old bits of history visited our historical museum not too long ago and shared his collection of early Riverside views. Now, I took one half of this and jacked it up a little. So here's my favorite picture of that era. 7 sharp dudes standing proudly in front of the local sales office of the Riverside Improvement Company, which it turns out was on Lawton Road. It was popularly known, I guess, as the old Creedon farmhouse. So we have 7 officers and directors and 7 sharp dudes posing with one apparent flunky, if you can see him, lurking in the background under the awning. What do you think? Are these our guys? I think they are. And lo and behold, that house is still there in a much expanded version at 220 Lawton Road. Our boys also published a sales marketing brochure in 1871, extolling the many virtues of Riverside. It's a beautifully done puff piece with terrific engravings of village scenes and homes. You will be happy to read that there are hardly any mosquitoes in Riverside. In fact, even in the back of this, there were ads placed by some people, including one by Marshall Field, when it was Field, Leiter and Company. This is available for sale at our historical museum. It's really a fun read. Or even if you take an Olmsted tour, we sell them. Unfortunately, as with many projects of this scope and audacity, things did not go well for the original promoters and investors in Riverside. The Chicago fire of 1871 and a nationwide financial panic that followed in 1873 put an end to the free flow of needed funds and led to the bankruptcy of the Riverside Improvement Company. Although troubles and chicanery began almost immediately. Fancy that. Frederick Law Olmsted certainly had no illusions about it. In a letter, he referred to it as a regular flyaway speculation managed on gold exchange and Erie Railroad principles. Or in a more modern analogy, we might say Bernie Madoff type business ethics. Or Samuel Friedman, whatever his name is, another new guy. Olmsted, like others, was willing to risk participating for the chance to earn up to $128,000. Wow. Well, that was equal to about $2 million today. And they were going to earn it from site planning, construction superintendents, lot sales, and miscellaneous projects. Early on, Olmsted discovered that the market value of the lots he had selected as initial payment might actually be worth less than 1/4 their value, as stated by Mr. Childs. Childs also wanted to have his own house built right in the middle of the lawn common. Now the big ballpark. He wanted to have his house there as a symbol of his exalted status in the planned development. Olmsted, understandably, had a fit over this, not least because 2 of the lots he had selected as payment would have exchanged their pastoral views for views of Child's laundry hanging out. Then, in addition to the Riverside Improvement Company, there were conjured up the Riverside Gas and Water Company, the Riverside Hotel Company, the Chicago and Great Western Railroad Company, the Chicago and Great Western Land Company, and the Riverside Normal School, a teacher's college. Some actually realized, but most not. All of them linked with a dizzying array of stock and bond issues, loans, commingling of funds, side agreements, recruitments of new investors, fallings out among old investors, vendors suing for payments due, lawsuits, lawsuits, lawsuits. Olmsted and Vaux fought the good fight as long as they could and did an excellent job of planning and superintending the early construction of the town. But after 2 years, they'd had enough and severed all connection with the project by October 1870, except for the ownership of the lots that they had selected in the payment. Poor David Gage came up short in his accounts as Chicago City Treasurer and ended up being indicted for loaning several $100,000 of city funds on his own recognizance to prop up the Riverside project. This may or may not have been illegal at the time, as city government finances were run fairly loose, and with the interest on such loans sometimes pocketed by the treasurer. Yes, he was even chided by one commentator for being accused of stealing such a small amount for a man of his stature and position. This was, after all, Chicago. He was ultimately acquitted, but his reputation was ruined. Mr. Childs, it seems, went in search of greener pastures. The 1880 census finds him back in New York, still in real estate and still fending off Riverside-related lawsuits. Despite everything, this group of, there's a few more headlines there about their adventures together. Some pretty good articles the Tribune had about this whole fiasco. Despite everything, this group of speculative businessmen and astute visionaries had created in Riverside something new in America. Whereas previously the march of suburban development might have used the motto, if you come, we'll build it eventually, but haphazardly. In Riverside, for the first time, it became, if you build it, they will come. By investing the modern-day equivalent of $24 million, they intended largely from the get-go to provide their suburban village with standard city amenities like municipal water, drainage, gas lighting, and all-weather roads. Today, of course, this is the norm for suburban development, which is why Riverside is one of the 10 towns that changed America and designated a National Historic Site in 1970. Riverside also made provision for its residents' spiritual needs with a Union church, now evolved into the much larger Presbyterian church on the same site, and a multi-use commercial building, the Riverside Stores, both designed by architect Frederick Withers, who was the third man in the Olmsted Vaux company that developed Central Park. After the departure of Olmsted and Vaux, it was Riverside resident architect William LeBaron Jenney and his colleagues, Louis Schermerhorn and John Bogart, who picked up the pieces and continued work on the town, which slowly grew. Jenney, designer of Riverside's water tower and many early Riverside homes, is also generally credited with the invention of the steel-framed skyscraper in Chicago. Here are some of Jenney's surviving homes in Riverside. Jenney also designed the Riverside Hotel, a large 124-room resort complex which sat on the site now occupied by the large apartment building across from the Township Hall. The hotel was connected to a dining refectory and ballroom right on the river. Wouldn't we like to have that back? The hotel burned to the ground in 1887. The residential part did. But the refectory was still there, and it survived as a hotel and later a private dwelling until 1945. An enduring Riverside mystery is why there has never been found any photographs of the main residence hotel or any of the glittering events which took place there. One of which was a gala held by General Philip Sheridan honoring Buffalo Bill. It's in his memoirs. It's really great to read. He got in there, he walked up to the ballroom, and he said he had never seen so many beautiful women in his life. And they all wanted to dance with Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill couldn't dance. So he stepped on a few toes, and then he quietly disappeared into the kitchen. Stayed there the rest of the evening. Oh, golly. So maybe we'll find some photos. Maybe they're in someone's attic and will turn up eventually. We hope so. After the Riverside Improvement Company bankruptcy, the Riverside litigation went on for a couple of decades. Who owned what and where was an unholy mess that took a long time to sort out, and land speculators ran rampant. It's always fun if you visit the Recorder of Deeds in the county building to find out that your property was once owned by someone like Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Or your next door neighbor in absentia was once Frederick Law Olmsted. For example, Mrs. McCormick once owned all the land surrounding Maplewood Road in Riverside, which on Olmsted's plan was designated as part of his grand park along the river. She also owned almost all the land west of the river in the never developed 5th, 4th, and 5th divisions of Riverside, which she later donated to be developed into the Brookfield Zoo. She was a bit of an eccentric who at one time thought she was the resurrected wife of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Eventually things settled down, although not without some major hiccups. Even in a quiet suburban place, some awful things can happen. We've had 2 major train wrecks in town, one a head-on collision in 1901, and then a derailment in 1911 that destroyed a good part of the railroad station. We can only hope there won't be a third, involving an oil train or worse. Then there was the water tower fire of New Year's Day, 1913, that destroyed the municipal water supply and necessitated the rebuilding of the water tower. Thank God the surrounding towns helped us get through that one. It didn't even take very long after the birth of flight for us to experience a plane crash, which occurred when a mail plane crashed near Cowley Road, South Cowley Road, in the 1920s. One of the pilots on this route was Charles A. Lindbergh, but he wasn't in that plane. After a while, actually very early on, Riverside became and still is a mecca for some of the world's finest architects to build distinctive homes. One of the great charms of Riverside is its diverse and distinctive mixture of architecture. There is something about the canvas that Olmsted provided that provides and inspires creativity in others. And you could just go on and on. I mean, there's so many beautiful, beautiful homes. Here's an 1870 map, and Riverside has definitely arrived. The railroad's here. And shooting ahead to 1886, we see rampant growth, including a whole lot of blocky subdividing where the zoo is now, which thankfully only occurred on plats in real estate offices. But for a somewhat more realistic view of what was actually here, we have this Riverside Quadrangle, surveyed in 1889 and 1890 and 1899 by the U.S. Geological Survey, assisted by the Army Corps of Engineers. And here they are. Up until the 1920s, the town was made up of some large estates and grand 19th century Victorian mansions with expansive grounds. Here's the Driver House on the site of what is now St. Mary's Catholic Church. And here are some large homes on what is now the Hauser and Central School parking lot. They're not there anymore. There were no street addresses until 1923. And the early phone books, in addition to some charming single-digit phone numbers, gave addresses as lot and block numbers. People came in from out of town, they needed somebody to guide them. The town was mostly quiet and insular, and some charming photos give a flavor. Here's Mr. Cross giving his grandkids a ride in his sports car. And some commuters heading for work. Charlie Lang was the village police officer, and he wasn't above jailing some kids for mischief until their parents could be found. Here's Larry the lamplighter, way over there on the lower right, making his twice daily rounds. The downtown, such as it was near the train station, was still largely undeveloped. Must have been a boring time for the kids here, right? Yeah, what could you do? I mean, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there was, not a lot of fun things to do. Well, the Ulick brothers of Downing Road, followers of the fictional Tom Swift, built their backyard airplane and flew it. Wow. I don't think they let them do that today. And they got up there and they recorded some early views of the roaring 20s in Riverside. Shortly, a decision was made to develop the town's largely undeveloped peripheries. At this time, the whole northern part of the town was still prairie. North of North Delaplane Road, there wasn't much there at all. So they started to subdivide many of the remaining lots to improve affordability probably, and probably to spread out the tax burden. The pace of development quickened, and in a couple of decades, most of the town was covered with housing, although in a much denser manner than Olmsted had envisioned. Even the Olmsted-designed parks were fair game for attempted housing until lawsuits and a state Supreme Court ruling put a stop to it. Large apartment complexes were allowed, even though not part of the original plan, as being essentially residential in character, as the lots involved were originally intended. So the town evolved, still a lovely place, still well managed, still somewhat inward looking. Many of the original homes that we have seen did not survive. Many did survive, but in heavily modified form, or even eventually evolved out of existence. Here's the evolution of the John H. Rice House. Okay, that's how it started out. It was at the southern end of Scotswood Common. Keep your eye on the sunroom there, the little round sunroom. That's how it ended up. And then it was completely demolished, and now we have a brand new home there. Some large estates were completely lost, such as the Louis Sullivan designed Babson estate, or survived by adapting, like the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Coonley estate. Many elements of the old homes and estates were scavenged and used in new construction in the village. Some elements are even in some of the world's most prestigious museums, such as the Art Institute of Chicago. A window like this from the Coonley Playhouse recently went for $220,000, and there were 22 of them. Still are, they had them reproduced again. Although many early homes were lost by fire, they didn't do tear downs as they do today, but they did do repurposing, otherwise known as adaptive reuse. So today in Riverside, you can live in a former school, a former convent, a former church, a former blacksmith shop, a former horse stable, 2 former grocery shops, a former carriage house, a National Historic Site, the old David Gage farmhouse still there, Selborne and Long Common, or an all-steel house of the future from the 1933 World's Fair. Been a little bit added on to since that time, but still all steel. Architectural styles do change over time, especially over 150 plus years, and the old in Riverside always made room for the appearance of the new. Some of our loveliest architecture is now of the mid-century modern or contemporary styles. "150 years of modern history means that when you are digging in your garden in Riverside, you never know what mystery you may expose. Some are easy to solve, like the ancient golf balls that originated in Mr. Babson's private 3-hole golf course. Some, like the old bottles and bottling debris, may be tantalizing hints of the 1920s speakeasy. The White Dove Club that existed off of Long Common Road in the northeast part of town. The curious mystery here is the amazing inability of the authorities to shut it down. I wonder why. And then there's some things that are just really mysterious, like the flintlock musket dug up in a backyard off of Lionel Road. Can't imagine how that ended up there. In the end, Frederick Law Olmsted made the right decision regarding Riverside, and the big speculation turned out all right. Thanks to the combined efforts of one genuine landscape genius and his colleagues, some flyaway hucksters, many honest investors, and a lot of back-breaking work by mostly unknown laborers, Riverside got established. Since then, it has survived such things as numerous attempts to despoil its parks, a plan to drive a 4-lane east-west highway through the northern heart of the town. That was in the early 1950s. Yeah. Economic depressions and recessions, we all know about those. Fires and floods. Yeah. Here's the sandbag crew. It has blossomed over time through the steady application and creativity of many involved and fiercely protective residents, public servants, architects, developers, landscape professionals, volunteers, and local business people who recognize a special place when they see it and will do what it takes to preserve, protect, and enhance it. So we all like it here. We've got some good neighbors and appreciative visitors. If you can make out the bald eagle there. We get along well most of the time in this beautiful place. But speaking of preserving, protecting, and enhancing, we know the work is never done. Here's the interior of our water tower, which cannot now be climbed to see the magnificent view because of insurance restrictions. I wouldn't be surprised if we found a way to do it. There is even a detailed plan for how to do it, believe it or not. In 2001, the Village of Riverside commissioned Antonovitz Associates, one of the premier architectural firms in the country, and they came up with a plan which would have turned the entire water tower complex into the Riverside Heritage Center. Why hasn't it been done? Money, ostensibly. But mostly, I believe, because by now it's been forgotten in the ongoing quest to keep our dear village solvent. But that was 20-some years ago. If we'd have kept pecking away at it and pecking away at it, I think we could have done it. We could still do it. The water tower is the symbol of our village. We should get back to work on it. Because whether or not Riverside, there's the schematic, by the way, of the tower that the associates put together. It was over 100 pages, though. Very detailed. Every weld was in there. Whether or not Riverside was born on the 4th of July, 1868, its modern spirit was probably most apparent on the 4th of July after 2008, when the community, despite severe economic difficulties during the Great Recession, would not be denied its annual observance. Nor would we during the pandemic. They found a way. They came around. We didn't give up. In like manner, citizen volunteers of all ages and village officials and staff led the successful efforts to save the historic arcade building. As a result, Riverside remains, astonishingly enough, what Olmsted originally intended it to be over 150 years ago. A great place to live. Thank you very much.
So Jim is willing to take some questions. I'll pass the microphone around. You'll still need to speak up. The microphone is for Riverside TV, not for the people in the room. So if there are any questions from the audience, I'll take them now. Bring the microphone to you.
If I can't answer them, we got plenty of people here that can.
Anyone? Yes.
Just a comment. You failed to mention that a couple of years ago, Lions opened up Hoffman Tower. So you can go to the top.
It's closed again.
Yeah, but I mean, something like that can be done.
Right.
Well, but the interior of the Hoffman Tower was never destroyed, but it was.
Here, sorry. Could you repeat that?
But the interior of the Hoffman Tower was never destroyed like ours was in the fire. And when they rebuilt it in 1914, they didn't rebuild the interior. And that's what the 2001 study said could be done. And then we even had a structural engineer come in and assess it, and it says it can be done. But again, it's money.
Anyone else? Questions, comments?
In the 1860s, was Riverside anything special with the Civil War involvement, or like any camps or anything like that around here?
Not in Riverside that I'm aware of. No.
Hi. Is there any knowledge about if there were any Native American outposts or villages before white settlement or before the 1830s?
Before the 1830s? I know there was a village, at least according to some of the early maps, there was a village in the Lyons area along the Des Plaines, and one a little bit north of here. I don't know that there was a village, actual village, in what is now Riverside. Okay, I haven't seen any evidence of that. But I'll tell you, when they built the first roads, I think I mentioned, they got the gravel from what was called the Joliet Mound. Okay, and it was sifted to which was an Indian mound, by the way, a naturally occurring mound, but the Indians had used it for hundreds of years. And the gravel was sifted to a 3-inch size, the heaviest gravel. And a letter was written by one of the people involved saying they were finding all kinds of arrowheads in it and everything else. Nobody really cared. They put them down. So there's probably a lot of Indian artifacts under our roads, okay, still buried very deeply.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay,
All right.
thank you all.
So I wanted to quickly thank Jim once again for his presentation tonight. Thanks to the Riverside Library for co-hosting the event with us, Riverside TV for recording. Recording of the meeting will be available on the Riverside TV YouTube channel. We have a few events coming up on March 23rd. Adrian Fisher of the West Cook Wild Ones will be presenting on native plant gardening. On April 27th, Charles Pipel, from a Riverside resident, will be presenting The Sweep in the Curve, Olmsted's Riverside, more history of Riverside, but also modern Riverside as an example of a sustainable community. We have the annual poetry contest sponsored by the Olmsted Society. That'll be held in the month of April. That's for students kindergarten through high school. This year, the vintage baseball game will be in the spring. It'll be on May 20th in the big ballpark. So thank you all for coming. Good night.